let's get back to these Walt's comments. So he goes into this part about, what a home means to him. He's thinking of Christmas services after midnight mass, where you go with your family.
He's basically that's some fluff.
That's fluff. He's talking about, and so he says we need to make things more affordable. But his example is not any of his plans. His example is a veteran's home loan that he was able to use that's existed for decades now, right? I mean, this is a VA loans is something we do all the time. It's something, Brian, you do all the time. I
thought that was interesting, because sometimes we've made this point, you've made this point, and I agree with you on that if you just give buyers more money, that just increases demand, which doesn't really solve the problem that we have, that there's too much demand, not enough supply, which is making home prices go up. But I did think it was interesting. I mean, at one point he talked about...
the next part, he talks about what's going on in Minneapolis. And
he talked. He said people with stable housing end up with stable jobs.
That was a true statement.
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting point. That when you talk about the pros and cons of these down payment assistance programs, the con is it creates too much demand. We already have plenty of demand. The pro is long term. If people get into home ownership, it does stabilize their housing payment so that 5-10 years from now, they have a more affordable, more stable payment than if they rent for the next 10 years. And that generally is good for a lot of things. So, I mean, that was a fair point.
He had a point about Minneapolis. They've done some things where they've seen a 12% increase in stock because they put some state programs. But I don't understand how it increases stock, meaning inventory, implementing a state program to make sure we give some of that down payment assistance. That doesn't correlate to inventory.
Right.
I think that locally, the better point he could have made there when you're talking about Minneapolis is like a lot of these issues actually aren't going to be solved at the federal level. They will need to be solved locally. And, Connecticut, I think you guys talked about it last week on the show, time to own programs. That's been a good program in Connecticut. That's been a local program with, local solutions. And so
this was my favorite line of the entire debate. He said, local folks, look, we can't do it at the federal level, but local folks make it easier to build these homes. I was like, oh my God, like that's what we're saying on this show all the time.
All the time.
Like there's no magic wand where somebody in the White House can just, sign some executive order and fix the housing problem.
It's actually the most truth he said, but yet he's still saying we need to spend money federally, give people $25,000. So he's talking, he's a politician, so of course he's talking out of both sides of his mouth. But yeah, we can't do it at the federal level, but local folks make it easier to build those homes. If you can't do it at the federal level, why do you have a talking point that says you're going to build 3 million homes and give out $25,000 to buyers? And
it sounds good.
Almost every housing analyst says the $25,000 handout will push up prices. In his response, unfortunately here, he didn't address either one, but I'm just thankful that they spent, that much time talking about housing because they avoid it. So
I thought it was interesting too, how a governor has a different, I think Waltz has a better perspective on housing than Harris or Vance because he's a governor. When you're a senator or you're, vice president or you're prosecutor, you're a little bit removed from the local politics, and I think maybe as a governor he has gotten involved a little bit more in some of the local politics that affect housing. So I thought that was interesting that he had that perspective. I think Trump probably, and you mentioned this on one of the previous shows, he kind of missed an opportunity because he did develop real estate locally in Manhattan. I would have loved to hear Trump say oh, when I was a real estate developer building apartments for people, I had to go to town hall and I had to figure out how to get these apartment buildings approved. And as president, I'm going to use that experience to, help pass laws that will, or orders that would improve housing. I think Trump could have talked about that a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, Trump's a business guy. Vance is a business guy as well. I mean, the thing when you say, hey, Harris, Waltz probably knows more about it. I mean, Harris is just a career politician. So, that maps for me. All right. Vance talking about housing. They go to him now. As far as your campaign's position, their take on some of their fixes would be to and this is in the question, the promise is to seize federal lands to build homes, remove regulation, provide tax breaks, and cut back on immigration. Which
That was a
you
moderator
say,
for that, right? That was the question.
This is the moderator.
Question. Yeah.
This is the question, which you say pushes up prices. Where are you going to build all the new homes you're promising? And what part of any of this plan will provide immediate relief? At least the moderator asked both like Waltz and now Vance, like, how are you going to actually build new homes? Waltz never addressed that question. And listen, by the way, the federal government's never going to be able to build 3 million homes. If you look at, when government goes to build that train out in California, Elon always laughs about that train that they're doing. It'll be like 50 years. They're moving like $1 billion, gets like a football field worth of train. It's like the most ridiculous project ever is building a damn train and a super train in California. Just look at how long that bridge in New Haven took. That was like, better half of my childhood.
Yeah.
Maybe all of my childhood. So yeah, I don't think the federal government's in any position to actually build 3 million homes, but could they do it through removing regulation, providing tax breaks, or even, this is an interesting idea, seizing federal lands to build homes. And so I'm going to avoid any of the immigrant discussion on housing, because I actually don't think it's a valid argument. Just like I don't think from Waltz's position that institutional investors are pushing up home prices. They're not. They own 0.5%, just over 0.5% of the single family homes.
Yeah, I think they're both pushing on people's fears and not getting to the root of the issue, both of them on that.
Institutional home buyers are not the problem. It's a lack of supply, and immigrants aren't the problem on prices either, because I don't think there's too many immigrants coming over from wherever the hell and going and buying a $500,000 house. You can see some of it when they're getting a free handout on the rent, and it can push up rent prices in certain towns and cities, but it is not an overwide issue on the country pushing up actual home prices. That's ludicrous. Okay, so, and that's where unfortunately Vance hits on that. Okay, but
he opened with that. I did actually like something Vance said later when he talked about the drill baby drill.
I do too, and I think this is an interesting way to approach it, so you can break that down.
Yeah, so I mean, if I look at what I think is impacting home prices is a lack of building over the last 10 years, which is largely related to the higher expensive building materials. COVID supply issues exacerbated the situation. It's typically only profitable for builders to build high-end luxury housing. It's not profitable for builders to build affordable homes, so there's no incentive for them to do that. There's a lot of local restriction. Those are the main issues that are affecting housing. So, I mean, Vance does get at that. I would have liked to see him elaborate a little bit, but he talks about if we make the cost of oil and energy cheaper, that will trickle down to cheaper housing goods, materials, lumber. And I do agree with that. I mean, that makes sense to me. But I think we could even go further, and I'd love to see him talk more about, incentives. And I agree with what Byron's saying. The federal government's not going to build these houses, but they could create some incentives for the private industry to encourage them to build the houses and kind of remove some of those barriers that we've had for the last 10 years.
Well, here's something interesting. I looked up where the federal lands were in the United States. So any state that is completely red and has all the federal land in it, it's all in the West. And there are 4 states, that are all redded out. Nevada, which is already saturated with housing.
And doesn't have enough water.
Utah, which I don't think you're going to get in there and take out all those mountains and ski slopes and state forest. Arizona, which is already a saturated market. Doesn't Arizona have one of the highest inventories in the country? And then the 4th one, Alaska. There's nothing east of it. So like nothing in Texas, really nothing in New England. You have a little bit in Idaho. Again, there's a lot of reservations out there. I don't think you're going to be able to go in there and seize these lands back.
Yeah.
And these are lands that are not being used for like national parks, obviously, right? that you identified?
They do include some of the national parks out there as well.
Because what the Vance's response, they had him follow up on this, and he says, well, Donald Trump has said we have a lot of federal lands that aren't being used for anything. They're not being used for national park. They're not being used, and they could be places where we could build a lot of housing. So here's what I'll give credit on trying to be creative because just saying we're going to give people $25,000, or just saying we're going to build 3 million homes and not having a plan for that, like this at least is a starting point of like, hey, maybe we could donate some land, which brings the cost of the build down on land that's not being used. Like, I want to think and reimagine what a new city could look like. There's at least some level of creativity. Again, probably not a high level of being able to be pulled off.